Welcome to Eden Theological Seminary and tonight's Bracke lecture. Eden is called to share resources to empower people, communities, and congregations who are committed to struggles for human freedom and to bearing God's witness of God's redemptive love at work in the world. And the Bracke Lecture in Leadership Studies is named to honor the ministry of John and Mary Bracke and their service for many years to Eden Theological Seminary. And in particular, to lift up John Bracke's embodiment of vocational resilience as he added a whole scholarly area of leadership studies to his vocation as a professor of Hebrew Bible. Upon his retirement from the deanship, John took up the challenge of adding to his portfolio of teaching leadership studies and taught for several years a course in congregational leadership. Many years of Eden alumni can testify to the formative role of this course in their Eden education. Eden is delighted to welcome one of our own alumni tonight, Reverend Russell Yule, as the Bracke lecturer this year. And Russell himself is a great example, like John Bracke, of Eden's goal of vocational resilience in the service of ministries for God's justice and love in the world. Now he's going to receive his proper introduction from Dr. Weisbaker, but let me, as I welcome you all, offer a special welcome to our wonderful alum, Reverend Russell Yule. And now, Dr. Baker.
Thank you, President Krause. The Reverend Harold Russell Yule II is ordained in the Missouri Conference of the United Methodist Church. He currently serves as the pastor of Terrace Lake United Methodist Church in Kansas City, Missouri. Additionally, he is the chair emeritus of the United Methodist Association of Ministers with Disabilities and serves as a board member of Missouri Faith Voices. As a person with disability in the pre-ADA America, his personal and system advocacy skills began to develop the day his parents enrolled him in kindergarten, he says. There, ophthalmologists and educators forewarned that blind students could not succeed in integrated classrooms. So don't bother dreaming of one day seeing your son graduate from high school with a diploma, they told Russell's parents. Proving conventional wisdom wrong, dead wrong, Russell graduated from Normandy High School in St. Louis, earned a BS in sociology from Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville. In 2009, he distinguished himself by becoming the first blind student to graduate from Eden Theological Seminary in its 168-year history. He also had the distinction of being the first blind person to be ordained in the Missouri Conference of the United Methodist Church. Reverend Yule advocates for people to realize their power and apprehend their goals. He talks across the country on disability and advocacy awareness, disability rights movement, the intersections of religion and disability, the intersectionality of disability and Black theology, as he will be sharing a little piece of that tonight. And Russell is a tireless advocate for a more liberating and inclusive theology of disability. He is passionate about empowering the disenfranchised and assisting all people in realizing their potential, purpose, and worth in the church and in society. Reverend Yule is the proud husband of the Reverend Adrienne Denson Yule. Will you all join me tonight in welcoming the Reverend Russell Yule, our Bracke lecturer for 2022. Welcome, Russell.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. And good evening, everyone. Um, would that I could see everybody, that would be wonderful. But in our virtual space, we are going to have a great time on tonight anyway. Um, if I may, I would like to thank President Kraus and Dr. Dietrich Wise Baker, definitely for that wonderful introduction, and the Bracke Public Lecture Series Committee for inviting me to become the 2022 Bracke Lecturer. And let me take this opportunity just to thank Eden for leaning in on disability justice throughout this academic school year. I know, and some of these names you all might not know, but I know that Dr. Peggy Way, I know that Reverend Ryan Matthews, I know that Reverend Don Whalen and others with disabilities who have matriculated through the hallowed halls of Eden Theological Seminary would be very proud of you all, proud of the work that you're doing, and proud of the work that you will continue to do in the area of disability advocacy and disability studies. Now, as we wade into this conversation on the intersectionality of Black liberation and disability justice, allow me just to say that my hope is that you will be able to follow. My hope is that my inflections will help us to stay awake. I'm not a joke teller, I'm sorry. But my hope is that we will be able to sift through this information and walk away with great information, hopefully something new, something that also will inspire, but also something that will kind of give you the unction to go out and to change something that you see that is wrong in our society. Now, allow me to begin with a little bit of background information, which I really hope will add to our thoughts about the questions and answer segment later on. So as you heard already, and I'm just going to lift this up just for a moment and tell one story. So I am an African-American male who self-identifies as a person with a disability. And so a close reading of my bio will show that I have personal experience in living the intersections of Black liberation and disability justice. So it's not just something out there somewhere, something that I'm theorizing about. We do that too, but it is my life. And so I began advocating for myself, again, as a 4-year-old, when my parents were told by doctors and physicians and by the school system, who really did not know what to do with me, that a person who was blind could not fare well in an integrated classroom setting. And so this led to my parents having to ask me, what do I want to do? And I appreciate them to this day for asking me that question. And so I made the decision that I wanted to go to school with the kids who I played with every day. And so that's what we decided to do. And every year I had to go and do an IEP and individualized education plan. But when I got to 5th grade, my 5th grade teacher did not believe that I was blind. She thought that I was acting out when I would tell her that I could not see the board. She thought that I was acting out when I told her that I could not read the books in class along with everyone because she would see me outside playing, but she did not understand how difficult even that was for me to play. And so she did some embarrassing things, embarrassed me, just kind of singled me out. And unbeknownst to me, she had placed in my file that I was to be marked as behavior disabled, which meant that I would spend the next few years in these classes that were called behavior disabled classes, where you just go in and you don't learn anything. You're just basically filling out 10 questions, and then the rest of the day you're playing cards. And so one day I looked around the class and I said, I don't belong here. And by this time I was in junior high, and my junior high principal said, well, the only way that you can get out of these classes is to test out. And because of the types of classes that you're taking, we know that you are not able because you don't have this information. And I told them, let's take the test. But they did not know that I had been at home studying already and having conversations with other people. I pick up very quickly on conversations and information. And so I took the test, and I scored college prep, except for math. I will admit that I am still not good at math this day. But they placed me in college prep classes because of that, and because of that advocacy that I took. And so my life has been formed and has been shaped by the resistance of the civil rights movement, by mentors who were on the ground in the disability rights movement, and we'll talk more about the movement a little bit later, and by one-on-one mentorships and the scholarship of theologians such as the late Dr. Nancy Eastland, who is a contemporary of President Krause. They went to the same seminary. But she is also from Springfield, Missouri. And other theologians such as James Cone, Debbie Kramer, and Dr. Cornel West. Now, this and my Sitzenleben, which shaped my theological framework and has informed who I am to this day as a pastor, as a preacher, as a teacher, as a public speaker, as an advocate, and as a writer. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to suppose that most of us are very familiar with the term Black liberation. So we're not going to spend too much time trying to unpack that on today. And looking at Black liberation, because there are many definitions of Black liberation. And so because we are in the seminary, I'm going to be speaking about Black liberation as it relates to theology. And so in theology, as it relates to theology, the late Dr. James Cone, he was the first who theorized Black liberation theology, which he continued to explore, continue to build upon, and continue to revise until his death in 2018. Now, just to get a simple definition for it, the Westminster's Dictionary on Theological Terms, it says that Black theology, which Dr. Cone would say Black liberation theology lives within Black theology because Black theology is a liberating theology. I hope I didn't lose you with that. But it says that Black theology is a 20th century North American theological movement which interprets scripture and the Christian gospels from the context of the oppression of Black people, engaged in the struggle for spiritual, for social, for economic, and for political liberation. Now, Before we explore the idea of disability justice and how it intersects with Black liberation, we must first look at the relationship between the civil rights movement and the forerunner of disability justice, which is the disability rights movement. Now, the disability rights movement, like many emerging social justice movements in the 70s, the 60s, and the 70s, it was born out of the civil rights movement. Um, um, in the United States, people with disabilities had been advocating for access to buildings, to employment, to education, for housing, and etc. for decades. However, in pockets around the nation, people with disabilities who had supported the work of the civil rights movement were inspired by the success of the strategies. So they made a decision to begin to advocate for the rights of people with disabilities in their communities by using these same modes of peaceful resistance and protest of their own oppressors and of their own, if you will, colonizers. And so today, books and documents and documentations about the disability rights movement, we find leaders such as Max Starkloff, who started Paraquad, which is in St. Louis, as an independent living center. And we find people like Judith Heumann, who was in the Obama administration. We find people like Harold Wilkie, who was a UCC pastor, who was actually lived in Washington, Missouri, and who signed the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we find people like Ed Roberts, who was the father of the independent living movements. They all tell stories about how this organic movement was informed by the civil rights movement. So we see how the work for disability rights, it had learned from the success of those working for the liberation of the African diaspora here in America. And so what happened was, in these pockets all around the country, people began to work for the advocacy of people with disabilities, began to work to get housing for people, accessible housing, to make buses accessible, transportation, all sorts of things, to get employment. And they had not met each other. They didn't know each other. They did not know that all of these people were all around the country, and they were having this same revelation about the civil rights movement and how they could use these same strategies to work for the betterment for people with disabilities. And so finally they began to have conversations, and they began to start what's called Centers for Independent Living all around the country. My last count, there were at least 28 Centers for Independent Living here in Missouri. And so they began to have these conversations and figure out there has to be a better way for us to work together to empower all people with disabilities. Now, that said, there was yet a problem. Although the disability rights movement, it said that disability is a non-discriminatory group in that anyone can join at any time due to accidents or due to injuries or due to chronic illnesses or due to diseases. Anyone can join at any time. but amongst those who were these people who were working for the voices of people with disabilities to be heard in the segments of society, even amongst those who'd experienced the sting of bias by ableist system and an ableist society, even in the midst of that, there was discrimination amongst one another. There was a hierarchy within the disability community. And here, and this is a word that I have to admit, a term that I have to admit that I got from Dean Krause when I was working on my master's thesis. Here, androcentric, heteronormative men with disabilities were at the top of this kind of system, and everyone else, they all were just anywhere that they could fit in. And all of his members were willing now, more than willing, to put their bodies on the lines as activists, whose protests oftentimes led to acts such as chaining themselves to buses. I've done that. Chaining themselves to businesses. And yes, even chaining themselves to churches and advocating for churches to be made accessible. It was always, even with all of that, even though that there were people from all cultures, lots of Black and brown people, because those are the people who, when calls went out that said that there needed to be an action, that something needed to be done, that we needed to have bodies. They called it flashing the chrome back then. And so they would get all of these people with wheelchairs, with canes and hearing aids and whatever, to come out. And most were Black and brown bodies. Yet, it was always white men who were called upon to negotiate the terms of the disability community's demands with all of the powers that be. Now, in some instances, Black and brown people were indeed at the tables. However, it was very rare for them to receive the recognition that was due to them. And only recently have advocates and have scholars began to go back and reinterpret and retell the stories of the movement, giving credit to all of those who contributed to it, and all of those who contributed to the movement. Only now are they beginning to do that. And so recognizing that the voices of many within the disability rights movement were not being heard. In 2005, a collective of disabled queer women of color formally coined the term disability justice. Disability justice, it builds on the disability rights movement, taking a more inclusive approach to help secure the rights of people with disabilities by recognizing the intersections of disabled people who belong to additional marginalized groups. Now, the disability justice framework, it asserts that we must include the experiences of all marginalized people with disabilities, people such as people of color, immigrants, gay, lesbian, transgender, QTA plus community, the homeless community, the incarcerated, those who had their land stolen by the United States government, those who are living in reservations. All of those voices have the ability and should have the ability to be at the table. In disability justice, it recognizes the diverse systems of oppression and and how it works to reinforce one another. It's kind of the things that, and I don't know if you are familiar with the Poor People's Campaign, and that's one of the things that they talk about all the time, is that all of these different systems that are set up that seem to only be coming at one group of people, they all work together to keep those who, if they were to come together, to advocate together, to work together, they can make a big change in the world. And so this is one of the things that disability justice makes sure that they talk about. Now, because of this broader focus on disability justice movement believes that it is properly positioned to be the best way to create a lasting change for people with disabilities who are living in marginalized situations. Now, Dr. Cone, as I prepare to close, I'm a preacher, so and I'm a preacher from the Black tradition. So, you know, we say, as I prepare to close, and it might be another 10 minutes, but no, it's not. But Dr. Cone once told me that Black theology and Black liberation theology are the academic endeavors, and that the prophetic tradition of the Black church is how they are lived out in the world. Now, in like manner, disability justice, in its truest expression, was never meant to be an academic endeavor, nor was it meant to be debated or to be intellectualized. Instead, it was created to be a framework for those who are the most impacted, for those who are the closest to the pain because of their disabilities and because of the conversations that we're having today, because of their race. Now, disability justice, it serves as a resource to battle the real day-to-day issues affecting people with disabilities' lives. And now it seems to me that this intersection of disability and Black liberation have always been in the mix with one another. It is clear that the disability rights movement, it emerged out of and emerged from the strategies of the civil rights movement and disability justice movement. It grew out of the disability rights movement because of the need for marginalized voices even within that movement, even within the disability community, for their voices to be heard and to be respected. So as we look to the future of Black liberation and disability justice, there are individuals who are reflecting right now and who are writing right now about how liberation theology might inform disability theology, all taking different approaches, but starting at the place of Black liberation theology and how that might inform disability theology. And my good friend, I don't know if he's on today, but he might, my good friend, Reverend Kendrick Kemp, he has coined the phrase, has coined the term Black liberation theology of disability. And his work was guided by and had the blessings of Dr. James Cone. He worked with him closely in fleshing out what it means to have Black liberation theology of disability. And for myself, I am exploring how Black liberation theology might inform the social model of disability in order to converse with the work of the late Nancy Eastland, who was the first that we are aware of who talked about a disabled God and talked about a liberating theology of disability, but she did not pull from Black theology, Black liberation theology, because she felt that her and Debbie Kramer, actually, they both have talked about this, but they never felt that it was for them as white females to do this work. And so my work is to continue the dialogue around disability liberation theology. And I look forward to exploring this topic in a book that should be coming out, I think maybe toward the end of the year, that Kendra Kemp set up with some publishers. And so we are going to be reflecting and writing from our perspectives in that area. Now really seriously, as I close, while my commitment to disability justice began at the age of 4 through self-advocacy, because of my life, because of what I have learned, because of my experiences, I have now turned it outward to empower people with disabilities with a liberating theology of disability, to advance this emerging field, and to advance and to advocate for little Black disabled children to have a future so bright that they have to wear shades like I wear shades every day. Amen. So thank you so much for sharing your valuable time with us this evening. And I hope that there will be some questions that came out and came through, something that you may have heard.
Thank you so much, Reverend Yule, for sharing with us. I'm so excited to have that entree to, I hope, be able to plumb deeper into the conversation about this intersection. And anytime that I have these conversations, I mean, I think we all want to know how do we not just talk? How do we actually begin to take steps to move as an institution? First of all, we're not asking folks to do what we're not willing to do ourselves. And so that's part of the conversation that we have to have tonight, not just with you, but other students who've experienced our setting and our institution, and who I believe have wisdom for us about how we move forward. But I think folks are starting to put in stuff in the chat, and I just want to, there's so much to talk about, but I want to talk about where is our invisibility? Where is our invisibility? You know, as you look at the community, as you look at church, as you look at institutions, how would you begin to name invisibility? What is it that we don't see? What is it that we keep missing? What is it that we keep stepping over? Help us to begin to, begin to see.
From what I have experienced and from what I've seen and from conversations with others around the country, it seems as though people with disabilities are oftentimes in the periphery. And so unless someone has a personal relationship with someone or has conversations with people, or someone feels empowered enough to be able to have these conversations with clergy, nothing ever really happens. One of the issues that oftentimes a lot of people with disabilities have is the fact that there's a power structure there. And so the church represents God. And so if I'm questioning the church, I'm questioning my church that I'm a part of, am I questioning God? And so do I have the power to be able to have these deep conversations that need to be had? And so I would say that the churches, that institutions have to set up listening sessions or set up ways in which to have these conversations so that people will feel empowered enough to be able to say what's going on with them. And fortunately enough, seminaries and institutions of higher learner are a great place to begin to have these conversations so that when people go out, they are empowered and they were able to make a change. I think about Brother Ryan Matthews, who was at Eden. I'd already graduated, but I was an Eden rat. As long as I lived in St. Louis, I was always back in Eden, writing my sermons and meeting people and advocating for them. And so I met this brother, and because of his relationship with his whole class was vested in disability rights. And so even to this day, when I talk to any of them, they are still vested in the disability rights movement. So, yeah.
Thank you, Reverend Russell. That's the questions are coming in, so I'll start siphoning them to you. But it feels like your answer gives us a few moments to take this talk about this for a minute, just as an institution, like for us to practice what you just said, for us to practice a little bit of what you just said, which is Reverend Elston McCall said, how Dr. Weiss Baker, how does Eden do more than just talk? How can, and it's a question for you as someone who, has come through, the hallowed halls, but there's others in the room who I think have wisdom here, but, talk to us about just your experience coming to this particular institution a little bit, and what is it that we, what did we do wrong? What did we do right? What do we need to change to be better?
So it is finding a way to empower students. It's finding a way for students to feel that they can truthfully articulate what it is that they are experiencing, the functions of their disabilities, and not feel as though they are less than because of the ways in which they have to do things. And so that is a great part. It's a great way to do that. And you had some professors, even when I was coming through, who assisted me with that. And then there were some who were not so good at all, just to be honest, because they were not educated yet. But I do know that, I know at least by the time I left and afterwards, they were quite well educated. But it is setting that up because, again, there, just like in church, there's a power system that's in place. And you're having people who are coming who have no idea about theological dialogue, about what this thing I just got into. This is not the language of the church that I serve. I don't know what and so you're wrestling with all of that, and you're wrestling with the fact that you have a disability. And do I fully tell people what it takes for me to do what you see me do? And so that's always something that is playing in people's mind. But I think the institution can go a long way by just being a place where people feel that they can share and not feel as though they are going to be looked down upon. So that's part of what I've heard from even from all of the students who've come before me and after me at Eden.
Thank you so much, Reverend Russell. That's a helpful insight to keep thinking over. And I invite others to jump in and to chat, use the chat to make this conversation as interactive as possible. Given that you are an ordained minister in the United Methodist Church, there's a lot of folks in the chat sort of asking, okay, with the clergy with disabilities, like, that whole journey, that pathway. What do churches, and I would say judicatories, denominational heads, folks that are involved in those processes, what do they need to be doing to make clergy with disabilities feel more welcome?
Change their theology around disability. You hear people, yes, you hear people even today who say that people with disabilities cannot serve the church because, they'll go back to the text and says, you can have spot, wrinkle, or blemish, have this disability or that disability, and be a priest. Even as much as I heard someone even a few years ago say that people who are deaf cannot be Christians. It's like, what? Their reasoning was the Bible says that let he that ever hear the word of God. And so because they can't hear, then they can't hear the word of God, then they can't be Christians. And when I tell you, these are still some of the things that are going through judicatories and people are wrestling with. I know a lot of pastors a lot of friends who are preachers who were not ordained in their denominations because they had disabilities. I know one gentleman who is he's retired now, but was a professor at the Ohio State University. But his conference would not ordain him because of his disability, but he was a professor for years.
Wow. Yeah, we have lots of work to do, apparently, in every angle. Thanks for sharing that wisdom. There's so many questions coming in. So you got us all excited. You said this piece about your new work on a new social model around disability justice. Can you take a minute and give us some of the pieces of that? Give us a little bit of that theological imagination and vision for the project that you're working on and the writing you're doing for the book.
So one of the things that people have stayed away from, and if you look at the language that you see when people are talking about a theology of disability, they number one, that's still a prolegomena. And so no one has done a systematic creation of a theology of disability because not one theology will work for everyone. And even Dr. Krause's friend and colleague, Nancy Eastland, who just changed the game, she recognized that, and she stated that I am writing for a particular group of people with particular functions in their bodies, and so you have to be specific, because that's one of the reasons, if I may, it's one of the reasons why James Cone continued to massage the whole definition of Black liberation theology, because others would come along and they would question womanist theologians and queer theologians. They would come along and question his first base. And so he had to keep expanding it. And so that's part of the theological dialogue. The dialogue has to continue to go on. And so my hope is to name a theology, a disability, and to name a liberating theology of disability. People are afraid to use those terms, but I just want to jump out there and begin to use them and let the chips fall where they may, because they're afraid of how they're going to get pushed back. And these are from the theologians who I talk to who are already writing in this area. It's like a third rail. They don't want to say that. And definitely when you talk about a liberating theology, they don't even want to address that. And so it's up to people like me and others who have nothing to lose, and we want to engage in this conversation using liberating theology language.
Wow. Okay. That has my mind going, but I'm going to stay focused here. Reverend Donna Sims has put in the chat, as a person who's differently able, am I able to advocate for myself, or do I have a support system that I am unaware of?
That's a good question. I would have to ask, do you have a support system? It is so important. And I can't remember if Donna graduated already, but I know that she was at Eden. It is so important to have your support system of people who are around you, who will advocate for you, who will, because sometimes, even when you're in seminary, if you're in seminary, it is difficult for you to speak up. And sometimes it is easier for your support system, your friends, to advocate for you. I'm reminded of a class that I had, and I had my computer speaks to me, but I have the ability to be able to turn it off. And so, but when I opened it, my laptop, it automatically begins to talk. And so I was in a class, and the computer did that, and the professor looked at me and started in on me about making noise in the middle of that professor's lecture. But it was my support system, my fellow students who went to bat for me, and that professor has really become like one of my greatest advocates after that day. So, but please, 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 please get a support system. I am always available. I'm putting it out there. Part of my commitment to Eden, and part of my commitment to those who will come behind me at Eden, is to be a support system for people as they matriculate through those hallowed halls. So.
Thank you so much for that. There's a very interesting question in the chat from Shiraz Gorman, a first level student who has a contextual education placement where she's working with a population who is becoming disabled through gun violence. And so Shiraz's question, I think, is a great one. How do we effectively incorporate this population into the conversation in disability justice when they are people who are often stigmatized because of how they became disabled through gun violence? And so, wanted to hear your wisdom about how do they become part of the conversation when they've been stigmatized because of how they've become disabled.
So this disability justice movement, they are definitely the ones who we will want to connect with, because they definitely looked for those who are the most marginalized. And like I said, including those who have been previously incarcerated. I know some people who have acquired a disability because of gun violence. And there are organizations, and I'll be happy to let you know about them. There are organizations I don't know where you are located, but who will reach out to them and will help them along their way in this journey, because it is a journey. It will be a journey for them. And the church really should be, if the church is the church really should be a place where the most marginalized can find community. So.
Again, continued work for us to do, Brother Yule. So many good questions in the chat. I think another one, folks who just want to know, in terms of the disability justice movement, how do we get in? This question is from Josiah. I can't find it exactly now, but it's basically, how do we get connected to the movement? How are we helpful and supportive allies? How do we connect, and how do we do it well?
Well, now with COVID, a lot of people with disabilities are not in public spheres if they can't help it. And so that whole movement now is a lot online. There are a lot of Twitter accounts and chat rooms and ways in which to connect online with the disability justice movement. Again, oh my God, you guys are asking some really good questions, and I wish I had a way of getting that information to you. But if that is a possibility, I would definitely love to get that to you.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Definitely use me as a resource, and I can post any resource that you have in Brightspace along with a copy of this lecture, so that it'll live, and the students will have access to it for a while. And we can send it out via email as well.
You guys are asking some really good questions.
So let me stop there. Before I ask maybe our last final two questions, just based on the conversation that we've been having, Reverend Russell, is there something that you want to say something more about that you haven't had an opportunity? I know sometimes when you're hearing these questions, it starts to stir up another topic or another piece that you haven't had an opportunity to share about.
Only for those who are, and I'm really thinking about those who may have disabilities, who either have not self-identified or are nervous about identifying, or don't have a community which to be with. That is so important. Please, if you want to come alongside and to become an ally, to walk with in solidarity with someone, I would suggest that you would do that. That would be wonderful. If you are a person with a disability, never want a person with a disability to feel as though they are alone and have to walk this journey by themselves. I have always been blessed that wherever I've lived, a community finds me, and it's always connected to the church. And so my prayer is that that will happen for everyone.
I think these are amazing final words, Reverend Russell, that you've just given us, that we might become, at least in these conversations and this work, more and more of that community at Eden, and be able to offer that wider and deeper. And again, not to just talk about this, but to continue to be on the journey to become it. We want to thank again the Reverend Russell Yule for being with us tonight and answering all these questions. There's lots of great information in the chat. And so I want you to make sure you save it so you can get the names of some of these ministries and some of these resources in the chat. And I'm going to ask everyone to unmute for a moment so Reverend Russell can hear your thanks and your blessings.
Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Russell.
Thank you, Reverend Russell.
Praise God.
Great job.
Amen.
I'll tell you.
The best we can do on Zoom. Thank you so much, Reverend Yule, again for being with us. And thank you all for joining us tonight for the 2022 Bracke lecture on leadership. And I pray that we will not just be hearers of the word, but doers also. God bless and good night.